So what I'm thinking, I don't know how the days went, so I have a bunch more slides now on actual causal discovery, like the algorithm that gets you from the data to the graph. And then a couple of slides just on what the data analysis for this afternoon is supposed to look like. And then we can take a break and get started on the coding. How does everyone feel about that? Okay? And please speak up if I run myself into a hole again, because as you know, stupidity increases exponentially the closer you go to the board. And I'm rather close. And I don't start from a high level in the first place. So don't start from a low level of stupidity in the first place. So how to identify the data generating graph? So there's one easy way, right? For each possible directed acyclic graph over the variables, test whether its independent structure is consistent with the independent structure in the observed data, right? That's a kind of brute force way that you could do it. But of course, if we go back to here, then for 10 variables, you'd be iterating over a few graphs before you could do that, right? So this is not going to be a really sort of efficient way, but it is a brute force way, yes? Now, you might say, OK, but we don't actually need to iterate over every graph. What we need to do is we only need to check this for each Markov equivalence class, right? Because if we have two graphs that we know to be identical in terms of their independence and dependence structure, then we don't need to check them separately. We can just check one of them. Yeah? OK, that sounds better. But how do we get that? How many are there for any number of variables? How many Markov equivalence classes are there? And how do we generate them in the first place, like to test them? So it's not obvious how to get the data generating graph given the data set, how to get the possible graph or the Markov equivalence class in the first place. OK, so one of the most widely used and simplest algorithms for doing causal discovery is the PC algorithm. PC, I believe, refers to Peter and Clark, who are Peter Spirtes and Clark Gleamore, who invented this algorithm. It might also refer to partial correlation, but I'm not quite so sure about that. Whatever it is, it goes by the name PC algorithm. And there are basically three ideas that underlie the PC algorithm. One is to say that if x and y are probabilistically dependent in your data, possibly conditional on some variable, then that implies that there is some sort of connection between the variables. And I can say precisely what sort of connection I'm thinking of, but that if you see a dependence between your variables, then they have to be somehow causally connected in some way. Okay? Maybe by a common cause, maybe by a chain going the one way, maybe by a path going the other way, right? On the other hand, if x and y are independent, possibly conditioning on some other variables, then that at least implies that there is no edge from x to y or an edge from y to x. At the very least, an independence. If I find an independence, I should be able to conclude that there's no direct edge between the two variables, right? Because if there were such an edge from x to y, then x and y would be dependent, so I wouldn't get this. Yes? That's the thought. And then the last is to say that, look, if two variables that do not have a causal arrow between them, how can they be made independent? Well, they can be made independent if I control all the parents of those variables. So let me illustrate what I mean by these three things. So for the first idea, the notion of connection that I'm talking about is a technical one called deconnection. It's a nasty definition. It's no point in learning that in the few hours that we have today. It's a technical definition of connectivity in a graph. Never mind what it is exactly, but it is formalized. And this sort of idea that if you see a dependence between variables, then that implies a deconnection, that is supported by what is known as the Markov condition. So the Markov condition basically says that if we have a dependence, a probabilistic dependence in our data, then we're going to have a deconnection in our graph. So one way, a simple version of how to think about this is to say the following. If two variables, x and y, are dependent, then what needs to be the case is that either x causes y causes x, or there is a common cause of the two variables. Maybe an indirect common cause, okay? So you can ask yourself whether you think that's a reasonable thing to assume, but that's the Markov condition implies the condition that I just stated for intuition, the principle of common cause. And the thought is that we can use dependencies as an indicator for causal connections. Okay, the second one is supported by the faithfulness condition. The faithfulness condition says that, well, look, if I see an independence in the graph, then that means somehow I can de-separate, I can disconnect the variables in my graph. They are not directly influencing each other, okay? And so now you can ask yourself as well, is that, can I have a causal connection between two variables and the two variables still being independent of one another? Now note, this is often we say correlation does not imply causation, but does absence of correlation imply absence of causation, right? That's what faithfulness is kind of suggesting, is that and so we'll go into a little bit more detail there. But so these two conditions are central to the PC algorithm, and we'll see why in just a moment. Yeah?
Yeah, here the condition means for all conditions or any condition.
Here, so it means that if I find some independence between x and y, possibly conditional on some other set of variables, then I'm sure that there won't be these arrows between them, right? But notice that independence, of course, requires that you go over all over all combinations of states, right? So if I say x and y are independent conditional on z, then what I'm saying is that that holds for z equals all of its, any of its values, right? Yeah. Okay, and then what do I mean by the last thing? Look at my graph again. If I want to say that, look, these two variables are can be made independent of one another, then I can ask, well, how can I make them independent of one another? The claim is that I can make them independent of one another by conditioning on one of their parent sets. Now, who are the parents in the graph? The parents are the obvious things in the graph. They're like one arrow up. So the parents of the magenta y are the magenta circles here, right? And the parents of the green x is the green parent here, right? And so the thought is that I can show that x and y are probabilistically independent either if I condition on this parent or if I condition on this parent set here. And so it turns out in this specific case, x and y are independent if I condition on the magenta set. Okay? So the thought, this insight here suggests that really what we need to find for any pair of variables is, or for each variable, is their parent set. That's the crucial part that we need to find in order to construct the graph. Questions? Yeah.
Is the circle, the very bottom, not a parent of x because it's
Oh, you're right. I screwed that one up. That's an error. That's an error. Sorry about that. Very good. This one needs to be green. What did I do? No, not text color, line color. There we are. Thank you. That was another error. Problem of first-time slides. Yeah? Does that make sense? Thank you. Okay. So we're going to, I want to walk, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
That holds as long as they don't have a common parent.
No, they can have a common parent. So if I had suppose I had another variable here that had arrows to both x and y, right? Then conditional on that and the rest of them, they would be independent. That's fine. I'm not quite sure which part you're worried about. So do I have a? So suppose this green one also had an arrow to y, then I would have to color this one green and magenta, right? But that would be fine, because conditional on this with the other parents, they would be independent. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, let's keep going. So I'm going to have a running example, and I just want to talk you through this running example, the features of this running example, so that when we go through the algorithm, you see how we recover this graph. We've got 4 variables. This is the true causal structure, which we don't observe. We only observe data from this causal structure. So just imagine like a linear model over this causal structure. Then if we looked at our data and we did all possible conditional independence tests, conditional and unconditional independence tests, then there are 24 of them. N choose 2 times 2 to the n minus 2. Okay? I can test whether z is independent of w, x is independent of z. I can test whether x is independent of w given z. I can test whether x is independent of w given z and y. Right? All of those tests are there. And I've indicated for all of these tests whether for this particular graph they would come out as independent or as dependent. This is probabilistic independence or dependence. And here are the independencies. Okay? I've just marked the 5 independencies that you would discover if you did all the tests. Now notice, you don't really want to do all the tests, because if you had to do all the tests and you put in for number of variables 10 here, then you can see how this is going to blow up like crazy, right? But just to give you a sense, we're going to, when we actually build the algorithm, have a much more efficient procedure, but this is all the tests there could be. Now, with all of these test results, if we could do them and you provide enough data, what we would find is that we could uniquely infer that this is the true causal structure. It's not obvious why that is. You might think that, oh, look, there is the V structure here. We could identify that one uniquely before, right? And now we can also identify this one. Why that is takes a little bit of thinking, but let's not go into that right now. The point is that it is indeed the case. This particular graph is uniquely defined by this independent structure. Okay? How about some questions? I've been not confident. You're all staring with like a after lunch kind of pre-nap stare. No? No questions. You're going to stick to your pre-nap stare. Okay, fine. So now we want to know, how can we get from just a subset of these tests to uniquely identifying that graph? No one? Any question? Nothing? It's just completely obvious?
The equation, can you explain it?
Oh, yeah. How do we, the number of tests. So when we do an independence test, right, we have 2 variables, right, and 2 variables that we're interested in whether they're dependent or not. How many ways can I choose 2 variables from n? Well, n choose 2, right? So that picks all the ways that I can pick a pair. And then I have to ask, well, what are my conditioning sets, right? I can have no conditioning sets here, right? I can have one conditioning, one variable in the conditioning set, or 2 variables. Now notice I have to subtract 2 variables because they are already the pair that I'm considering, right? I don't test z is independent of w given w. That doesn't make any sense, right? So this gives me the number of pairs, and this gives me the number of conditioning sets that I can have, right? And that's then unfortunately explodes. Yeah. Good? Yeah, okay. So what does the PC algorithm do? It starts with a complete undirected graph over the number of variables that you have. So we had 4 variables. We're assuming, I'll be running through this example, assuming that the true graph is this one here, right? And I'm going to show you what happens in the PC algorithm, okay? So remember, it's a Y structure. All the arrows are pointing down into W. Okay, so we start with a complete undirected graph over the set of variables. And then we perform all unconditional tests. What do I mean by that? We perform all tests without a conditioning set, okay? Now, I showed you before, that's these ones, okay? There are 6 of them. So we have to perform n choose 2 tests, which is a quadratic number in general, but it's not too bad yet. So in this case, it's 6, yeah.
So in the previous slide, these tests, they are fixed every time
you have four kind of variables.
I don't know what you mean by fixed. So indeed, these are the 24 possible tests that I could have over 4 variables. But of course, for different graphs, whether they turn out to be independent or dependent will change. Yeah, but there are 24 tests for 4 variables. For 3 variables, you can work it out. 3 choose 2 is 3, I think, times 2 to the 3 minus 2 is 1, so just times 2. So that's 6, right? So for 3 variables, you just have 6 tests.
And what does what's the difference between the condition of set size 1 and set size 2?
Yeah. So here, I'm testing x and y. Are x and y independent or not given z? And then are x and y independent or not given z and w? So I know more. I'm giving you more information about the system the larger the conditioning set size is, right? Yeah, good questions? Yeah, sure. Okay. So we do all the unconditional tests. Now, some of them, one of them returned an independence, right? What do? The moment we get an independence, we know there can't be a direct edge between those 2 variables. If x and y turn out to be independent, then there cannot be an edge from x to y or y to x. Otherwise, they would be dependent. Yes? So that one goes, right? The top edge between x and y goes.
And a couple of other things go.
No, nothing else goes.
Yeah, arrows from Z to X and Y go, for example.
Z to x, no, because z and x are dependent, so the arrow doesn't go. Z and x are not independent, they're dependent.
No, but if you go back to if you go forward, what goes are arrows from Z to X and Z to Y, right? Because if those existed,
Ah,
X and Y.
yes, but when you, so
Give the complete undirected
if
graph
it,
you're starting with.
you are using more you're saying that Z cannot be a common cause of x and y. That's right. However, there can still be an edge from Z to x.
Just not to both.
Right. So what the PC algorithm does, it does not remove. There can't be an edge from Z to X anymore at this point. But the PC algorithm doesn't perform that inference just yet. It just takes out the direct edges between the 2 variables if it sees an independence. It takes out what you're concerned about later. So just sit tight for the moment. Okay, so at the moment, I can only take out that adjacency between x and y because it's still possible that I have an x to z edge and that it's still possible that I have a y to z edge there. So I can have to keep those adjacencies. Okay? Okay, what happens next? For each pair of variables a and b in your graph that are still adjacent, and each third variable c adjacent to a or b, test whether a is independent of b given c. If so, remove that edge. So basically, what are you doing? You're increasing the conditioning set size by 1 now, but you only consider conditioning set sizes of variables that are adjacent to the ones that you're considering because you're trying to find parent sets. Okay? So this goes back to the idea here, is that 2 variables that do not have a causal arrow between them can be made independent by conditioning on the parent set of one of the variables. So we're now going to say that, okay, I was not unconditionally x and y, or unconditionally 2 variables were still dependent, but I'm now going to try and see whether I can make them independent by conditioning on one of the parents, one of the things that is adjacent to the variables. How about some questions? I feel it's gone very quiet. No?
So far, all of the connections are undirected.
Everything's undirected at the moment. Yeah, no direction at all. Yeah. What's going to happen in the PC algorithm is we're going to find the skeleton of the graph first, which means it's the structure without the edge endpoints, and then we do go over it a second time and start orienting what we can. Okay, so what does that mean? At worst, this is 10 tests with conditioning set size 1. It depends a little bit on what order we do the tests in. So let me say, why 10? There are 12 tests here. Why would we only have to do 10 of them? Yes, well, there's already, exactly. So which ones do we not have to do? Yeah, these two tests we don't have to do, right? Because the first two tests we don't have to do. Why? Because the condition was for each pair of variables where A is still adjacent to B, but X and Y are no longer adjacent, so we don't need to consider that again. We're done with it. Okay? So at worst, we could do fewer than 10 tests if we luck out, but at worst, we'll have to do 10 tests. If we do 10 tests, then indeed, what we will find among those 10 tests are these two independencies. When we find those two independencies, what do? We remove the edges that were here and here. Yeah? Why? Because if there were a direct edge between X and W, then we couldn't have X and W independent conditional on Z. Yes? No? Maybe? No? I mean, you'll be happy that someone has programmed it for you later and is going to, that the loop will do it internally itself. But sometimes it's useful to know what these black boxes do. OK. So we ended up, after those 10 tests, we ended up with this. Now, we're done with the conditioning set size 1. We increase the conditioning set size again. For each pair of variables still adjacent in the graph, and for each pair of variables C1 and C2, both adjacent to one of either A or B, again, we're just trying to find parent sets, test whether A and B are independent given C1 and C2. If so, remove AB. Remove the AB adjacency. So what do we have to do here? We will be testing ZW. Is ZW independent of XY? Is ZY independent of XW? Is XZ independent of YW? Given YW. Sorry, I said of. I meant given YW. Yes? So we have to do, if we go back to the set of tests, there are actually 6 tests here. We don't have to do the first one because X and Y are not adjacent anymore. We have to do this one. We have to do this one. Sorry, X and W given Y and Z. X and W given Y and Z. Yes, we do have to do this one. Sorry, we don't have to do, you're right, because we knocked it out right here. We don't have to do this one. We don't have to do this one, but we do have to do these two. Yes? Yeah.
So in the condition set size 1,
Mm-hmm.
why do we have to look at, for example, y and z given x? Well, we already know that x and y are independent. Like, I just want to...
Y and Z, so this one here.
Yeah, for example.
Because at this point, right, at this point, so here, right, we're here, and we're going to look at y and z given x. And you're saying, like, that's not going to happen, right? That can't do anything because x doesn't have some path back to w. Y and z given x. Well, because you could still, hang on. So let me see. Y and z given x.
Is it because z will still be affected by x?
Well, z is affected by x, right?
If we don't know that when we run the tests.
Yeah, but so, no, I'm actually thinking because you still have a connection, right? You're going to get a dependence because, you're going to get y and z, so that one. So you have a dependence between y and z. You're trying to see, can I remove that dependence? The candidates are, I have to condition on the neighbors. I have to find the parent sets of either z or of y, right? And x and w are still candidate parents. So you have to iterate through them. Now, there is you could do some smart tracking that actually from x, how would you get over back to y, right, to make that connection? But then you have to add in a search algorithm that tries to find all the possible paths and whether there actually are paths. And so it's actually faster to just iterate through the parent sets that are there. Yeah, so it's a little bit, sometimes it does tests that you technically wouldn't have to do, but it's more efficient to just do the test rather than to actually search whether it's necessary or not. Yeah. Okay, so what you do next, you continue by iteratively increasing the conditioning set size, just as we did before, but you stop when either you run out of adjacent pairs to consider, when all conditioning sets of size n-2 have been checked, or when the conditioning set size exceeds the maximum of the neighbors of either the number of neighbors of A or of B. Those are the three rules that you would stop looking for. So at this point, we've done all the tests of size n-2 there that we can't condition on 3 variables anymore. So we conk out because we have checked all the tests, right? And then we stop. So this one doesn't go any further anymore. We can't do anything anymore. Okay? So this ensures, these stopping conditions ensure that I don't actually, in general, have to do all possible tests that might be required. And then there's a last step where you now iterate here. You look at the triples. You look at triples of variables like this, where they have 2 edges. And you ask, are x and y independent of one another? Because if there were a chain from x to z to y, right, then they wouldn't be independent of one another. If the chain were from y to z to x, they wouldn't be independent of one another. If z were a common cause of x and y, they wouldn't be independent of one another. So the only way that x and y can be independent of one another is indeed if the arrows point into z. We're discovering the V structure here again. And so that allows you to orient this triple of variables pointing into z, and that goes to Ralph's case earlier, is that this is where you then get rid of the case that z could be a common cause of x and y, because you realize that if z were a common cause of x and y, then these wouldn't be independent of one another. And then you say, well, what about this triple here, y, z, and w? Well, if w pointed into z, then w and y would have to be independent. But we know they're not. So that means this arrow has to be oriented downwards. So this is one of the cases of an implied orientation. And then that gives us the full graph that we wanted in the first place. And remember, there were 24 tests in total. We got there with a maximum of 19, which in this case is not much difference. But once the number of variables blows up, there's a massive saving in the tests if the graph is sparse. Okay, so what's the idea of the PC algorithm? You're basically searching for independencies somehow. You're iteratively searching for independencies. And the moment you find an independence, you knock out the edges. You take out the edges to simplify the graph. And then once you've taken out the edges, you keep searching for independencies, but you don't consider all possible conditioning sets. You only consider conditioning sets that are among the neighbors of the variables that you're thinking about. That's the goal. Okay? Now, in some sense, none of you have to worry about this sort of thing because this is fully implemented. People have coded this up, have proven things about it, so you don't need to sweat having to code this up. But I think it's useful to understand why it saves you the explosion of the number of tests that you would otherwise have. What's nice about the PC algorithm is that it's correct and complete given the true, so what does that mean? It means that given, if your independence tests return the correct results among the variables, then the PC algorithm identifies the Markov equivalence class of the true causal graph, of the true causal directed acyclic graph, which, given that we talked about the completeness, at least for linear Gaussian models before, is all that can be identified given the independent structure. So we now have an algorithm that actually achieves this sort of result, this sort of limiting result that we had talked about earlier. Now, the complexity is pretty bad still. In the worst case, it's exponential. If you have a complete graph, you'll be searching for the independencies forever, and you're going to have to run through all the possible tests. That's what it's going to blow up. However, in fact, it's bound. If your network is sparse, then the complexity is bounded or is controlled by the largest degree k of any node that you have in the graph. So if you have a very sparse graph over tons and tons of variables, but the most densely connected variable only has 3 or 4 neighbors, then it's exponential in 3 or 4 rather than in the number of variables that you have. And so the use cases I'm familiar with scale to several thousands of variables, but only in sparse networks. If you have very dense networks, I think it's going to be just a few hundred variables, or even just tens of variables. How about some questions about the algorithm? Yeah.
So if I have a large data set and I need something to reduce my dimensionality in that data set, so principal components analysis or something like this, maybe induces some kind of false or real orthogonality. And how does that connect to what I'm going to define and find as a
Yeah.
graph?
But you can't say anything in general about that. But so, of course, if you're doing principal component analysis, you're going from a large number of variables, and you're reducing that down. Now you're mapping that to the principal components, and maybe you're only considering the first 3 or 4 or 10 or whatever of your principal components, right? Now, you have completely mashed up the causal relations by putting it through the linear transformation there. And now it's a little bit unclear whether you can really talk about the principal component as a causal variable, right? Because the principal component is a linear mixture of the underlying variables, right? I actually I'm not quite sure how to think about this in all cases, because if we think about our mental states in our mind, right, then we might say, well, aren't they somehow, do they not arise from our neural states? Are they not functions of our neural states? And maybe something about our mental states is like a principal component of a certain neural state or something like that. And so I would like to think that some of my thoughts have causal effects, right, which suggests that I can think of this sort of aggregate variable as having a causal effect. But it's very difficult to say something in general about if you put it through any old dimensionality reduction algorithm that you can still make sense of the causal relations that result, or what it even means. Yeah.
So for the pattern that given here, it tells you the connection between A to numbers. So what about the weights, as you showed in the early slide? It showed from A to X to Y have an actor.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, but here it's only 0 or 1.
That's right. Good. So I've done the structure discovery now, and now the second step would be to say, okay, now let me fit the actual functional form. But if you know that this is the causal structure, then what do? You say that, oh, now is this a linear Gaussian model? Okay, in that case, I just have to fit a linear regression of z on x and y, right, and a linear regression on of w on z, and then I've got my edge coefficient here and here and here, right? So once I'm done with the structure discovery, I can then compute the parameters of the model, right? That's the thought. Yeah, good question. Actually, that's what we're going to do in the actual coding later. Okay. So I say here the PC algorithm is complete, which is which means that the Markov equivalence class is all that we can identify given the assumptions. And now I'm being vague about the assumptions, so let me say what the underlying assumptions of this algorithm are, and you can ask yourself whether you think they're reasonable for your setting, right? So there are 5, I think, key assumptions that are not light assumptions. They are quite substantial. So let's think about them each individually. So the Markov condition, we had talked about it earlier and, as well, says that if we see a probabilistic dependence, whether conditionally or unconditionally, what that implies is a certain type of connection between the variables that's known as deconnection. And what that says basically is that if we see a dependence, we think there's some sort of causal relation between the variables. Now, it sounds a little bit like correlation implies causation, but that's not quite what it is, because deconnection only allows for certain types of causal connections. And the example I gave earlier is, I think, the most intuitive one, is that if we see x and y are dependent, then that means, according to the Markov condition, that either x causes y causes x, or there's a common cause of the two, right? And by x causing y or y causing x, I mean either directly or indirectly, right? That's what it would mean. The faithfulness condition is the converse of the Markov condition and says that, look, if we see an independence between our variables, then we think that they're causally disconnected, so that's deseparation. I know that it's a bit annoying not to know what exactly the definition of this is, but just trust me, this definition is not so trivial. It's a complicated graphical condition. I spend an entire lecture on it when I teach this sort of thing in a normal course. Causal sufficiency actually came up in the question earlier. We are assuming here that there are no unmeasured common causes of 2 or more measured variables. And of course, in many circumstances that you might be working in, that's a very unreasonable assumption. Similarly, for acyclicity, right, we talked about this before, is that when we talked about the number of directed acyclic graphs over 3 variables, I said there were 25, and the last 2 that were missing were the cyclic graphs, namely where the causal structure goes round in a cycle. Now, again, for the brain, this seems kind of a very, very strong assumption to make, to say that there's no feedback in the brain. Let me come back to the problem with acyclicity or allowing for cycles later. And then lastly, we're assuming that the data is independent and identically distributed. So if you're measuring MEG, for example, or EEG, you're sampling extremely fast. And so from one data point to the next, you might have autocorrelations that would violate the IID data assumption. In fMRI, there are also autocorrelation, but the sampling is a bit slower. And we could also sample at larger intervals. So actually, in the data that we're going to be looking at later, what we did is we took the fMRI data and didn't take every data point that we sampled, but took every 20th data point or something like that, okay, to try and decorrelate the different samples. Okay, let's think about what happens when things go wrong. So this is the case that you asked about before. If we have an unobserved common cause between 2 variables, then what do we do? What happens if you feed that into the PC algorithm? Sorry, go ahead, sure.
In a point, you mentioned it, but I didn't quite catch it. The acyclicity, does this mean that there cannot be bidirectional arrows between?
Yes, so well, it means several things, and that's one of them. So x to y to z to x, that would be a cycle. But of course, if x and y just cause each other, that's the bidirectional one. I take it as what you mean, is that here x causes y and y causes x. That's also disallowed by acyclicity. You said bidirectional arrows. I'm just going to mention it here. So in the causal literature, this sort of arrow with 2 arrowheads is always interpreted as an unmeasured common cause. So this means that there is some latent variable that causes both, and you just don't get to see the latent variable, right? This is different from saying that x causes y and y causes x, which is then you'd have to put in 2 arrows. Here, the bidirected arrow means that there's an unmeasured confounder, okay?
How about y to itself?
Okay, interesting. So y to itself, that would also be a sort of cyclic idea. Let me come back to that as well, exactly what we mean by y to itself, right? Because I'm imagining what you're thinking of this as is that y has an influence on itself at a later time point or something like that, right? So that's a good point. That's also disallowed in this sort of case. Yeah. So, okay. Not cycles, but the causal insufficiency. What about if there are unmeasured common causes? Then x and y would be dependent. We discover a dependence in the data, right? And what would the PC algorithm do? It would return an undirected edge. It wouldn't be able to say which way the edge is going. But of course, we know that, in this case, we know that neither x causes y nor y causes x. So we get an error. We get too many, if there are unmeasured common causes, basically our output graph will have too many edges in it. Okay? Now, what do we do about that? This is what I mentioned in response to you before, is that we need a different algorithm. We need to then say, okay, let's check out a different sort of algorithm than the PC algorithm. For example, the FCI algorithm, it's a different sort of algorithm that allows for latent variables. And then the underdetermination will be greater in our output, but we can handle or explicitly represent the possibility that there might be an unmeasured common cause in our data. Right? So it's a substantive assumption that the PC algorithm makes, and then people have worked on it to weaken it and then to see what the implications for the causal inference are. What about the faithfulness assumption? Now, remember, the faithfulness assumption said that if I see an independence between two variables, then I say there is no causal relation between the two variables. Now, under what circumstances can I have an independence between two variables, but still a causal relation between the two? It's a really bizarre thing, right? So does absence of correlation imply absence of causation? Well, let's think about it. If this were a linear model and I give you the edge coefficients here, what is the correlation between x and y? Give it a good guess if you don't know how to do it mathematically. 0, right? Because the correlation between these two would be minus AB plus A times B is 0. In a linear model, in a linear Gaussian model, if you have 0 correlation, that means the two variables are independent of one another. So we would discover in the data that x and y are independent of one another. So the PC algorithm would remove the xy edge, right? But obviously we know that there is a edge of x to y. So this would be a violation of the faithfulness assumption. Now you can ask yourself, is this something that you have to worry about? I do think it is a very substantive assumption. But you might say that, well, look, in order for this sort of cancellation of different pathways to happen, right, you need perfect cancellation of the parameters, right? You need exact balancing out of the two different pathways. Everyone with me, or everyone has entered the afternoon slumber? And so you're all wishing for it, that you could enter it. So then you might say, look, I'm fine making the faithfulness assumption because this thing that they exactly balance out is so rare. What would you say in response if you'd still be worried? Why is that perhaps not?
It would be relative to the sensitivity of your measurement.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Predictive texting here, good. But we're always subject to measurement error. So depending on how precisely you can estimate this, if your measurement error is such that you can't estimate, that you only estimate these sorts of parameters within a band, a wide band possibly, then of course you don't know whether you have exact cancellation or not, right? So in fact, this is quite a bit more worrying, this sort of violation of faithfulness, if you have almost cancellation of pathways, right? So what do you do about this? Again, people have worked quite a bit on this to weaken the assumption of faithfulness, to look for other assumptions that can play a similar role. But and there are algorithms that don't require faithfulness, but one always then has to look what other assumptions do they add in to help out, right? So there are generally other assumptions that have to do some of the heavy lifting then in that case. Questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so you just assume some kind of marginal error or virus noise data. So does that mean the first step of the PC would not that effective? I mean, some kind of like the independence and the correlation would be very small, but does that mean zero?
Yeah, well, so, okay, but so you can, so what happens here, right, is that PC would detect an independence and then knock out the edge, and then as a consequence, you'll have knock-on effects further down the line, because suddenly you will think these two are disconnected, whereas they actually are connected. Now, you're saying, well, okay, you might say is that, well, maybe even if there's a weak correlation, I should keep it in. Well, but then how weak are you going to go, right? That's always going to be the worry. But yes, that's the part of the PC algorithm that will introduce the error.
Is there a way, there could be circuits in the brain that kind of take this kind of form, where there's a direct inhibitory pathway between X and Y and an indirect excitatory pathway through this kind of long route. But if you know that kind of thing with just the
Yes, okay.
minuscule measurements, you know that kind of structure is there. Can you embed that kind of wire into this algorithm?
Yes, you could, but you always then want to ask, what are the conditions under which you take out an edge, right? When are you actually going to say that you're going to remove an edge from the graph? Because, of course, you can always leave in all the edges and then just have a complete model, and then, of course, you can fit any sort of data that you want, right? You could do that. But I suppose the way to go in those sorts of circumstances where you actually think that you have maybe these sorts of canceling pathways, and I think your example is very good, because there's often this sort of homeostasis where there's a sort of backup path that balances out. I mean, if you think about it now, the temperature in this room is independent of the sun outside, right? Why? Because the air conditioner is just balancing it out right. So, and now, do you want to say the sun outside has no effect on the temperature in this room? Well, they might be independent of one another, but I think we have exactly this sort of canceling out effect, right? I think in your case, what you would want to do is you want to look at somewhat different assumptions that are used that weaken faithfulness as much as possible. But ultimately, you're going to have to bite some sort of bullet to say what your condition is to take an edge out. And it will induce errors. Yes, that's right, if you have these sorts of... But so think of it this way. How, if you can't ever detect any sort of dependence between the two variables, right, aren't you at some point going to say there is no causal connection? Well, presumably you want to somehow disrupt the one of the pathways, right, that you want to see that. Okay. So it's a tricky problem. So acyclicity, several people have now asked of various forms of acyclicity. The main problem with acyclicity, other than that it's technically very, very complicated, is that you first need to get clear about what you actually mean by it. Because it's very easy to draw a graph like this. But generally, we don't think of something being able to cause something backwards in time, right? So if x causes y and y causes z, then z can't cause x anymore because x is past. We generally think as causation as forward moving. So you must mean something else when you draw this sort of cyclic graph, right? You presumably mean, it's my guess, something, in fact, that looks like this, where you're saying, I've got a time series, and x at time t causes y at time t plus 1, y at time t plus 1 causes z at time t plus 2, and z at time t plus 2 causes x at time t plus 3, right? And you are using this sort of graphical notation to basically collapse that sort of time series model. Yes? Is just my guess at what you might be meaning when you draw this sort of thing. Maybe you mean something else, but then you need to get clear on what exactly it is that you mean by this sort of model. Now, if this is what you mean, let's just think about that sort of time series model for a moment, because it's very tempting to think that, well, we could just time index all the variables and then still learn a perfectly sensible causal graph unraveled over time, right? I mean, we just, instead of 3 variables, we might have 6 variables or 9 variables or whatever it is, right? We could just build the acyclic graph like that because it's acyclic over time. Yes, no, maybe you're all very quiet. Faces look exactly the same when you're bored out of your mind because it's so easy, or you have no clue what's going on because it's so hard. You look exactly the same. It's very frustrating. Yeah.
Knowing that most systems exist in time.
I'll grant you that one.
If we didn't assume this kind of decomposition
Mm-hmm.
across time, would this kind of acyclicity suggest that there is maybe a fourth unmeasured cause here? Like it seems to me conceptually difficult to imagine a system where X causes Y, Y causes Z, Z causes X in the same time moment without some kind of like additional outside of the system unmeasured cause that is actually in fact the simultaneous cause of all three.
Yeah, okay, good. I mean, you might get a cyclic system out as an error from misspecifying your model, right? But I think people worry about the acyclicity assumption because they do think that the brain is full of feedback, right? And so I think when people say that, I can't assume acyclicity, what they mean is something like, but my system is acyclic over time. And then my reaction is that, well, if you've got a really good time series and you can time index all your variables, we can do some sort of causal inference on the time indexed graph, right? And then we're in good shape. If it arises as a model misspecification, then it's a much more complicated issue. So what I'm trying to say is that I think there is a genuine sense of cyclicity cyclic causal models that people mean as not being an error of inference. And so I'm trying to make sense of that. Yeah. But it's still tricky because now you say that, look, that's exactly what I meant, and look, I'm measuring my system at each point in time, and then what you would get is this sort of, in a short notation, this sort of graph here that is nice and cyclic. But suppose that unbeknownst to your machine only measures every second time step. What would your graph look like then? Like that. Right? Can anyone see what my next slide is going to be? So notice that if you have a cyclic system and you mean this thing here by it, then it becomes very interesting what your sampling rate is relative to the speed of the underlying causal system. Because if generally, nature always plays along with exactly the model that you specify, right? And you say, okay, I sample at every time step, and nature is always going just one time step forward as until I get my scanner back to the starting point and can scan my new, get my new scan, right? No, obviously not. Often the systems will be much faster, will evolve much faster, and you will be sampling much slower than the actual causal speed. But now notice that it becomes a little bit ambiguous about what you take to be the true graph, because depending on what your sampling rate is relative to the underlying causal process, you will get either a cycle going clockwise, anti-clockwise, which way is this going? Anti-clockwise, a cycle going clockwise, or no cycle at all among your variables. And this is assuming that all of your causal effects here are even in sync, roughly, with what you're doing, right? That you're taking multiples of your time step. And you could have causal effects that are much slower than that. Okay, we need to switch over soon to the analysis. But no one's bothered by it. You're all sitting back, whatever, this is just modeling. I find this really troubling because I actually think it really, if someone comes along and wants to give me a cyclic model, I really don't know what they're talking about for a long time because these sorts of sampling issues really play into it. Yeah.
Is there a way out of this of saying, okay, I'm going to always sample fast enough so that I'm faster than the fastest anything that happens over the microwave style?
Yeah.
Or does that automatically mean that my data needs are going to explode and I'm never...
No, I think you're right. So I think the MEG and EEG folks would claim that they're faster than the neural speed,
Yeah.
right? And then would say that, okay, I'm fine, I'm sampling faster than the connectivity. But you can still then worry is that, well, some neural connections might take 2 time steps, some might take 1 time step, some might take 1.5 time steps. So the alignment becomes very interesting now of how this goes, this discretizing that you have in your sampling rate relative to a causal process that is still slower than your sampling rate, right? So.
Sure, yeah, discretizing to a very large number of variables is not an attractive...
No, I don't mean to variables, but to time slices. Yeah, but you're discretizing, I mean not only the variables are the horizontal rows, right? But what I'm worried about is that you're separating your samples, and depending on how fast or slow this causal process is, even if your sampling rate is faster than the fastest causal process, it's not that they're all going to be in the sort of same sync, or it's unclear that it's going to be in the same sync each time, right?
But so you're basically saying you would have a non-stationary causal graph. At different time points, the graph looks different.
Yeah. I mean, but it could be, yes, that's one way of thinking about it. But it's non-stationary for an artificial sort of reason because it's an artifact of your sampling rate, right?
Well, no, but if your sampling rate is fast enough, you would say it's really not I mean, it's actually changing. There's the effective connectivity between these nodes is changing.
Yes.
Enough time.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
the edge has its own
Yeah.
time collapse.
Yes. Yeah.
One more question. I have some intuition on this, but let's say we have a system that our sampling rate is higher than the biological process, but then for whatever reasons, we actually create beams of like a certain size that is not very long. Does binning change? Will it change the diagram, even if we identify it? Will the diagram on the raw and beamed data differ?
So you're binning time steps?
Exactly. Let's say we got our recordings. The sampling rate is higher, but now what we're doing is that let's say we use 10 beams and we collapse information across.
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure how then. So then what you do, you take averages within bins or something like that. But so then, yeah. So but now notice that the effect of one bin on the next will be a mixture of different time points of the variable, right? So because you're collapsing several z's together, they might all have different sort of lags in. It will be a mixture of all their lags. What you're seeing then, right? So I'd have to have a look. I actually don't have a very clear idea what the effect would be on the graph if you do the binning like that.
I see.
Yeah.
But our intuition would be that we are not able to extract the relationship between variables.
No, I think it would be sensitive to your bin width. Yeah, I mean, just to make this very salient, I mean, this is what we see when we watch car wheels on TV, right? That suddenly they start spinning backwards, right? Because the sampling rate of the helicopter rotors that they start spinning the other way, because the sampling rate of the image frames does not line up properly with the rotor speed or the car wheels, right? Does everyone know what I'm talking about? Say that again.
Aliasing?
Is that what it's called? Yeah, no idea.
So I think this doesn't work, but I don't understand why. So here we have very standard gaps, right? We're doing this kind of sampling at exactly the same time. So what if we were, like, what happens if we offset, have random sampling times?
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that solve the problem? Does that compound the problem?
Well, so what are you going to have as a result? You're going to have so you're going to then get a mixture of these three, right? And disentangling what is coming from where is unclear. I think, to me, the fundamental problem is that it's a misconception to think that the causal influences all happen at some sort of one step at the time. Let's all take one step forward together, right? We all go at different speeds, and so the causal influences come in at different times as well. And it's not obvious to me that sort of random sampling of the time series will make things easier. Yeah. So there's a lot of work on cyclic causal models. It's technically very, very sophisticated and quite difficult to get into. I think most of it makes very strong assumptions about the sort of setup that it's in. So certainly the work that I've done on cyclic causal models relies on fairly hefty assumptions. And I think ultimately, if you have a sort of system with feedback, it's very, very important to first get completely clear on what sort of feedback you're thinking about or what you want to model. And then we can start thinking of how we might address it for causal inference. It's generally this sort of question of, like, what do you actually mean by this sort of graph that I think hides most of the problems. Okay. Lastly, the Markov condition. The Markov condition says that, so a violation of the Markov condition would be that if you have a dependence between two variables, but x doesn't, so let's just have two variables, there's nothing else, and x and y are dependent, but x doesn't cause y and y doesn't cause x, nor is there a common cause of the two. This would be a violation of the Markov condition. So you have a dependence, but you don't have anything that explains the dependence. Now, you can ask yourself under what sort of circumstances you could imagine that you get dependencies between variables popping up out of nowhere, and whether those sorts of violations are genuine violations of the Markov condition. There's been quite a bit of work on this, and I think outside of quantum mechanics, so if you're familiar with the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment, then you have these sorts of special cases which seem to indicate a violation of the Markov condition, at least if we analyze EPR classically. I'm not aware of any sort of case where we can plausibly say there's a violation of the Markov condition and it's not a violation of some other assumption like causal sufficiency or IID sampling or something like that, which then suggests that the Markov condition is really a fundamental part of how we think about causality in the first place. That if there is a dependence, there is some sort of causal link, some deconnection that explains it. If you're interested in this sort of relation to quantum mechanics, I've got a whole lecture on that as well. Happy to talk to you about it if that's where you want to go.
But so in biology, you could easily think of many cases where there's an apparent violation of the Markov condition if you have X causes itself. If you have two clocks, right? If I have a clock, if I have some periodic process in one cell and the other, if at some point in the past, there must have been something that synchronized them, they had a common cause, and they have a memory, and they keep going, I could erroneously think that there's a dependence.
Yes.
And that happens all the time.
Yes, but in that case, I would have said you have a violation of causal sufficiency because you have an unmeasured common cause there. It's not a violation of Markov. So, so that's why a lot of the violations of Markov are actually violations of, or a lot of apparent violations of the Markov conditions are actually violations of something else. Of one of the other conditions. And to find a genuine case where you think you have all the variables on the table, you've not somehow misspecified the model, it's a completely accurate model, and you still have this sort of violation is In quantum mechanics, we do get that. Okay, so we're getting to your part of the day. Here's what we're going to try and do. We have resting state brain fMRI data and from the Human Connectome project. And we can use that to generate, so we have that for something like 880 subjects or something like that, but we've combined it into 11 large data sets. And we can compute just the correlation among, so I should take a step back. So we've got the fMRI data. It's been parcellated into brain parcels. So there are about 110 parcels dividing up the brain. And we have the activity of these parcels over a certain time period. And so then we can look at the correlation matrix when we line up each of the parcels along the x-axis with each of the parcels along the y-axis and see, okay, this parcel here is very correlated. This parcel here on the right hemisphere is very correlated with a corresponding parcel on the left hemisphere, okay? But then we can ask ourselves, what gives rise to this sort of correlation? Can we actually construct the graph over the 110 parcels and put in some edges of where we think the connections might be? And so that's what we'd like you to do. So just a little bit of background on the data. Some of you will know this data a lot better than I do, so chime in if you know more or if I'm getting this wrong. So one of the really nice things about this sort of large-scale data collection of the Human Connectome project is that sample size is almost not an issue. You've got something like 1,200 subjects that were scanned essentially in the same scanner with essentially the same protocol, and they have been scanned multiple times in the same way. All the data has been pre-processed in the same way. So there are very few cases where this sort of standard, well, actually in fMRI there are more and more cases like this, but it's a really wonderful resource to have super standardized, cleaned up data over a large number of subjects, where we can really then explore how well these sort of causal inference methods work and how reliably we can recover things from different subsets of the population here. The Human Connectome project is much larger than just this fMRI data. There's also MEG data and EEG data for some of the subjects. There are interesting family relations between the subjects and that sort of thing with twins and parent-child relations. We're not going to use any of that, but we are going to use the healthy adult population here for the fMRI data. And we're basically relying on about 800 subjects for the data that we have. The original data is measured at a resolution of about, I may as well fill in the entire slide then, is measured at a resolution of about 90,000 voxels. And these 90,000 voxels are then parcellated by one of the geniuses who worked here before into the Harvard-Oxford parcellation, which has about 110 parcels. It has, I think, 48 parcels for each of the hemispheres, and then the remaining parcels are subcortical. This picture is actually from a different parcellation, but I couldn't find a nice corresponding picture for the Harvard-Oxford parcellation. And so what we have for these subjects is we have 4 runs of data. We have 110 parcels for each of them, and each of those runs has 1,200 time points. So for any of you who do fMRI data, this is like an hour of data, hour of resting state data for each person, which is really quite nice, I think. We sampled this sort of data sparsely, taking every 30th time point or something like that, so that we wouldn't have autocorrelations between the sample points that we have, and generated 11 data sets which are from disjoint sets of subjects. Okay, so there's no subsampling or anything, no bootstrapping or anything like that, but 11 disjoint data sets. And the thought is that if you each pick a different data set, we can check in the end how similar the sort of inference is that you get out in the end from between each other, or you could use all the data sets and bootstrap yourself. And so just so that we're clear, for those of you who do fMRI, you will correct me here, but just so that we're clear in how indirect we're measuring the brain in this case, we've got about 80 billion neurons that have interactions on the order of 10 to 100 milliseconds in a time series like this, quite densely connected. And then what we are actually measuring are 90,000 voxels. So you have the massive aggregation from 80 billion neurons to 90,000 voxels, and we're only measuring them every 3/4 of a second, right? So we have an aggregation both in spatial resolution and in time resolution, right? But of course, it's getting even worse than that. We're then, before I go there, this, because of the hemodynamic delay, right, the bold signal measures just blood oxygenation level, not the actual neural interaction. You know all this better than me, but just to remind you, we get this sort of effect in the bold signal about 5 to 6 seconds after it actually happened in the neurons, which is interesting, for example, if you do interventions with electrical stimulation, then you have to wait for a while for it actually to peak. So this has caused some trouble in the analysis I did in the past. And then, of course, we aggregate spatially even further from these 90,000 voxels into 110 parcels in the brain, right? So it's massive aggregation. And the parcels are not all the same size. They'll have different numbers of voxels in them. So keep in mind that this is in some sense it's a lot of data, it's high quality data, but it's a very, very indirect measurement of the brain. And it's an enormous aggregation both in space and time. So we've prepared, so thanks to Iman, we meaning Iman has prepared a fantastic worksheet to go through. And we'll help and try and work through with you. So if you take a look, there are going to be 3 exercises. The first one is actually just purely artificial data, creating the Y structure, looking at the Y structure, looking at whether you can recover the Y structure just from the data. The next one is also artificial data, just learning a chain structure where the chain, is not uniquely identified from the independent structure. And so you will not get a unique graph out. And then once you've done the easy cases, then it will ask you to load the fMRI data and do exactly the same analysis that you do with the toy graphs with the actual fMRI data. And if it's any consolation, this is one step of exactly the analysis that we did in a paper, Ralph and I and Julien Dubois and several others several years ago, where we looked at this HCP data. Okay, I think that's it. Here's my picture for causal discovery. What I want you to do is that there's some underlying ground truth. You're only going to get to see the data. We've given you the inference algorithm. We're going to throw in a whole bunch of assumptions that will be way too strong, but then we can ask about how do we weaken them, and let's see what we can get out about the causal structure for this sort of data. So thank you. And thanks to Iman for doing all the coding. Let's give it a go.